This, then, is the sovereign state of New York. With its people, there are 16 million of them, more than any other state, and with incomes that make them the largest consumer market in the world.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we delve into Chapter 20, 3rd Avenue Penthouse, New York, 1963. This chapter digs a little into Saroyan's value system. It begins with him explaining that he and one of his rich cousins were walking around New York City when they saw an apartment building being built. Overlooking the East River, the Queensboro Bridge, Astoria across the river in Long Island, and other junky places. The unnamed rich cousin convinces William to invest in one of the unbuilt apartments, it being a better deal than staying at a hotel for months. William concurs and puts in a deposit for several months of rent on a penthouse, some 22 floors up. Saroyan imagines the women he will bring to the penthouse and how he will have to lock the door to the terrace so they won't jump to their deaths when he tells them he won't marry them. Recall that he was now twice divorced from his wife, Carol, and never did sustain another long relationship with a woman after that. Construction of the apartment was delayed. Eventually, a month after he was promised, it was completed, and he moved in only to find that machinery on the roof vibrated his apartment, creating heat for the building in the winter or air conditioning in the summer. This proves untenable, as he was unable to write with the disruption. So he breaks his lease, is sued by the building owner, and leaves. This turns out to be his last apartment in New York before he lives more regularly in Europe. When he did return to New York, he typically stayed at the Royalton Hotel. Saroyan's biographer, Lee Lawrence, describes this period of his life as the start of isolation into a hermit stage. Lawrence claims that Saroyan traveled less, cut more people out of his life, and quotes the book Days of Life and Death and Escape to the Moon from 1970. Saroyan writes, "From a swift young man, delighting in new clothes, moving everywhere with noise and laughter, I became a sloppy old man in old clothes, with a careless posture and a lazy walk, going nowhere. What did I expect? Well, the fact is, everything of an external kind I got, such as fame and money, but it always turned out to be only from myself, and that had never really been the idea." After the war and the failed marriage to Carol, William was never able to bounce back to his more carefree lifestyle. The 1960s saw him dig into writing his memoirs, trying to make sense of his life and the inflection points that led him to an emotionally low midlife crisis. By the time he writes Places Where I've Done Time, he had plumbed the depths of his neuroses, and many of the stories are repeated from previous memoirs, as he publicly gives himself psychotherapy through his books. Only 3 books were written after Places, all memoirs. In this chapter, he begins with his wry comment about his busy rich cousin convincing him to make an investment that ultimately went bad. There's a sense of repulsion, bitterness, a pinch of jealousy in this description. He might have been referring to Ross Bagdasarian, whose own wealth and fame, from Alvin and the Chipmunks, were eclipsing Saroyan's, especially as William gambled away most of what profits he made. He makes particular bones about the owner of the building, who was very rich and had on very new, very narrow, very highly polished black shoes on his feet. He says such shoes are worn almost as a religious rite by an order of man of the world who may best be described as a self-deceived success. As ever, Saroyan held no love for the upper class, and especially those who pretended to be better than anyone else. In his 30s, wealth equaled success to Saroyan. By his 50s, he had had his share of wealth and fame and felt no better off internally. He mocked those who believed their wealth reflected a moral superiority. When Saroyan left due to the humming apartment, the owner in the highly polished shoes sued him. He tells us it cost him new money to fight him off, but the man quit like a dog and went back to his narrow shoes, his narrow successes, and his narrow wealth. Although Saroyan had opportunities to become a producer and make loads of money on the business end of art and entertainment, he rejected that line and believed that writing was the only way to be true to himself and not sell out. This decision plagued him as he struggled to keep financially level, and the world moved on. In 1963, and in 1969 when he was writing Places, Saroyan's values were that money corrupted a man, and he disparaged the rich around him as phonies. He had come full circle from the starry-eyed 20-year-old who admired the seedy underbelly of the city, the struggling immigrants, the Depression-era poor who were kept down by the tycoons running America. New York, and America in general, was losing its luster to Saroyan at a time when the consumerism was booming. Families had moved to suburbs, and a cultural war for the soul of the country was just on the horizon. Saroyan wanted no part of it. Even though his children lived in New York in 1963, William was jaded, beginning to self-isolate, and ready to nurse his psychological wounds in a small flat in Paris. This is one of the Wry chapters, a comedy of errors that shaped Saroyan after he fell out of the public limelight. To him, the world had become a dishonest place full of charlatans, like the owner of his penthouse apartment. He knew he could win certain battles against these types, but that the war was eternal. It was during these years that he leaned heavily on his extended family and the fantasy of a Fresno from the past. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.